Throw things at me.
Awesome.
Hey, you got sound, right? When you talk, it comes out here?
Am I mic'd? Okay. Nope.
We can start, and I'll try to deal with the mic in a second. Let me just make sure. Yeah, we got sound back here, so.
Okay. Is this
For
one
the essence
hot?
of time, let's get started.
Is this one hot too? Does it matter?
Yeah, I have to get the guy that handles that, but we're good to go, so.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to introduce Ryan Permeh. I was actually lucky enough to work with Ryan years and years ago. We were both in sunny California, and now he's over in Oregon where it's not quite as sunny, and I'm stuck here in the cold hell called Cambridge. Anyway, Ryan has a pretty amazing talk about vulnerability from both sides of the fence. So when we worked at EI, we like to kick a lot of shins like at Microsoft, and now he is the product manager for McAfee. So please welcome Ryan Permeh.
Good morning. Everybody here okay? Excellent. Well, again, my name's Ryan Permeh. I'm the manager of product security over at McAfee. I've only been there for a relatively short time, but it's been a real learning experience. As Oliver said, I came from a research background. We spent many years at EI Digital Security, which is a computer security research organization and also a computer security products organization. I did both research and development there, a lot of reverse engineering and dealing with exploit development and individual vulnerabilities. It gives me a kind of a different background of understanding how it is to be a researcher. And then now at McAfee, we have 29 products with several million lines of code, up to above 12 million lines of code, effectively that we have to protect. So I'm seeing it from both sides, from a researcher side and from a product vendor side. This talk is going to be a little bit focused towards software vendors. Out of curiosity, does anybody here work for a software vendor? Excellent. The reality that we're seeing out there is that a lot of people don't have well-defined application security initiatives, and they don't have well-defined policies for dealing with researchers. And effectively, over the years, there's been a rift that's developed, and I've seen it from the EI side, where I was probably, quite honestly, a part of building that rift, and now I'm seeing it from the McAfee side, where seeing how researchers interact with vendors from both sides. So effectively, we have to start with the prerequisite scary graph. Vulnerabilities are growing. Every year we have more and more of them coming out. Realistically speaking, these are just numbers. This includes things like cross-site scripting. The severity has been pretty even breakdown, but with more vulnerabilities, there's more high-risk vulnerabilities. This can come from a lot of different factors. Research skills are no longer black magic. We aren't worried about just that one little kid sitting in his room that somehow got the magical powers to bust software. We're worried about trained organizations for multinational corporations and governments. We're worried about criminal organizations. We're worried about the group of people who can download a tool and understand its output to the point where they can find vulnerabilities now. So the fact of the matter is there's a lot more software. New class of attacks like cross-site scripting and various other attacks have risen in recent years, bringing the level of technical ability to find a vulnerability down to a pretty low level. So the reality is the numbers are going up, but what does that actually mean? Well, for us, it just means that we have to be more and more vigilant. So, in this talk, I'm making the rough assumption that there are two players. We have the researchers that span from the very white hat good guys down to the very black hat bad guys. And then we have the vendors. Now, obviously, we're talking in generalizations here. Not every situation is going to fit either side. On the researcher side, though, there are some common motivations. And from my past, I can say both the first two there, demonstrating technical excellence and the search for fame, are very potent drivers for the research community. There was one point where I had my picture on 1,500 newspapers because the AP picked up a vulnerability that we found in UPnP. So effectively, the search for fame is very, very important to the research community. Realistically speaking, now fame could be more centralized within your peer group rather than mass media fame, but realistically, that's still a driver. There are still, in the whitest of the white hats, a search for the common good. People who care about the health of the internet and are doing research to drive infrastructure improvement and make the internet a generally safer place. On the other side, there are people who are literally responsible for this. Groups like MITRE and many of the groups that are funded by grants to do research into infrastructure projects. It's quite literally their responsibility to look at how the internet can be abused. Many times colleges get involved with this. In recent years, it's become a lot more common to have money being a driving factor for researchers to go. There's a rise of open and closed markets, both public and private, for selling vulnerability information, both Zeroday and then also the exploit information generated for already known vulnerabilities. Finally, since we're talking about the whole scope here, there are very bad things that happen. There are people who are very talented, but somewhat skewed ethically, where that's pretty much the reason that everybody here is part of the computer security world, is because there are bad guys out there. So, let's talk a little bit about vendors. Basically, vendors is a very generic term. It could be a commercial software vendor like a McAfee or a Microsoft, and it could go down to any organization that builds software, really. Effectively, there are two different feelings in this camp and sort of a continuum of between them. You have the sort of neophyte vendor who breaks in or gets exposed to the security industry, where they just hate where they hate researchers. They wish all this stuff would just go away and they don't have to worry about them. And these motivations are justification for wishing that researchers would all go to jail. So, good for your customers? Yeah, well, if researchers were in jail, they wouldn't be finding bugs. Responsibility? Well, they feel that it's the researcher's responsibility, not theirs. PR and brand? If the researchers didn't find it, we wouldn't have to worry about the media. We wouldn't have to worry about the damage to our goodwill. Effectively, there is a more mature stance that many vendors are beginning to take, where they understand the value of researchers. And they understand that there are positives as well as negatives, and that you can actually differentiate yourself in the world where software has bugs. People are beginning to understand it. Microsoft has them, Oracle, SAP, McAfee, Symantec. Everybody who develops software has bugs. Now, a sign of maturity is how you deal with that. So by demonstrating technical excellence in this sense, we just have to show that we're better than our competition. We can be a differentiator. We can actually come out and be honest and say, there are bugs. We've had them. What we have is a coherent plan to actually make them better. So money comes down to that by winning customers from having competent bug handling, and by having your customers have absolutely terrible, or your competitors have absolutely terrible bug handling. You can actually find yourself in a differentiator situation. Finally, right now, it's sort of a gray legal area, but legality and regulation is quickly becoming a very important part of why a vendor needs to actually be very conscious of the application security space. So, the reality is is that vulnerability has changed pretty drastically in the last 5 years and the last 10 years. 10 years ago, it was almost entirely underground. 5 years ago, it was very public, but not very commercial. Nowadays, as I mentioned, there are commercial endeavors dealing with vulnerability. Groups like ZDNet, iDefense and Tipping Point's ZDI initiative are willing to pay researchers for vulnerabilities that they find. There are closed and open markets like Wabi Sabi Lobby where you can actually go and buy zero-day vulnerabilities. Groups like Immunity work with other vendors who sell zero-day exploits. These are information that are not handed off to individual vendor companies, and they're effectively zero-day information until whoever buys it decides to disclose that information. So, the reality is that FAME is a less likely scenario. The media has kind of begun to adopt a ho-hum attitude about new vulnerabilities. It's probably because of the meteoric increase in the number of them. It's just becoming static now. You have to literally break the internet now to get a third page mention in a physical newspaper. There's still always the trade magazines and the computer tech magazines online and print where there's still some media coverage, but for the most part, it's died down. Obviously, as I said, there's a different kind of fame with your peer group. So publishing to BugTrack or Full Disclosure can still give you a certain amount of coverage within your peer group, and you can begin to build a name for yourself, a reputation. The reality is that vendors that make things hard for researchers are going to lose in this battle. Vulnerabilities are going to be pushed into the zero-day market, and they're just simply not going to hear about them. One of the things that we have to realize is just because you're not getting vulnerability reports does not mean that the information isn't out there. Now, as always, it's very difficult to classify an unknown and what your exposure is. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you do that from a software vendor perspective. So one of the things that we can do is to begin to streamline the vulnerability research or vendor researcher relations here. Effectively, we need to kind of repair that bridge. And actually, a funny thing happened yesterday. I had been planning this talk about how researchers aren't so bad and software vendors should be very nice to them. Yesterday at about 11 a.m., somebody decided to drop a 0-day on Full Disclosure for a product that I own. So I've been dealing literally for the past 24 hours live with the 0-day issue, dealing with all aspects of our software development organization. Yesterday, when this hit, I was very tempted to go in and change my tone here and maybe knock down a little bit of the everybody should play nice attitude. But the reality is that vendors and quality researchers really can work together very, very well. So realize that not every player, be it a software vendor or a researcher, is the same. They don't all come from the same motivations, and they don't all act in the same way. There are very, very ethical researchers out there. I've met some exceptionally intelligent people over the years dealing in the research community, as are their vendors. Groups like Microsoft, who have really done a serious effort to vastly improve their security stance, are really doing the right thing right now. So there are quality vendors out there that are working towards making the world a better place. So obviously researchers are not going to get dollars from vendors. I've heard of stories of it happening, but quite honestly, any researcher that came to me, or while I was a researcher, if I had gone to a vendor and said, I want $1,000 or I'm going to 0-day this vulnerability, they would laugh at me and or probably call the feds. Realistically, that's basically extortion, and it's pretty illegal under our laws right now. So, FAME, good vendors and good researchers can work together. Crediting in an advisory is very fair, and it's very common practice right now. Some will even go as far as saying that researcher XYZ worked with us very well, in their PR and media reports, although a lot of times PR and media tends to kind of push away from the problem rather than acknowledge it and say what you're doing to make things better. So the other thing is you can reward good researchers if they want by hiring them. Many large companies utilize researchers, and sort of what we're talking about, the crux of this talk, is a focus towards how to use researcher technologies, how to use researcher techniques, how to build your organization to think like a researcher. Why not just hire some? Quite honestly, it's a quick way to jumpstart an initiative like this. Obviously, look for quality and look for ethics. Much like any hiring practice, there are smart people that range from very ethical to very unethical. So, in the end, however, both sides should strive to avoid antagonism. This does not have to be a confrontational relationship. Realistically speaking, a quality researcher who's telling you about a bug beforehand and willing to work with you to get a patch out there is doing you a strong service as a vendor. And vendors should understand that and be very willing to work with researchers. On the contrary side, researchers should be willing to step up and actually work with vendors to deal with getting a patch done. So, teaching vendors to think like researchers. Realistically speaking, there's a strong aversion in the vendor space right now of treating security as if it were an important part of your software development process. Right now, most security most software companies, if they have a security policy at all, it focuses around post-vulnerability release information. So, another requisite scary graph growing up. Effectively, this is a graph showing the standard how it's much easier to fix early in a cycle to the end of a cycle and much less expensive. This has been around since the 70s. It's used back and forth to show that bugs should be fixed at the design or requirements phase rather than in post-release. This is especially true in relation to security vulnerabilities. Right now, as of right now, literally, I'm scrambling to get patches in place because of this vulnerability that was released. I have done a dead stop on 4 different dev teams to make sure that this problem gets brought forward. The reality is had we fixed this prior to it going out, we wouldn't be in this situation right now. Using techniques that researchers typically use, we could have found this. McAfee is building an application security practice, and what we have here is just a couple of slides to describe on how, if you develop software, how you can actually begin to build an application security practice in your organization as well. So there's really a bad stuff that can happen. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, question. Using these numbers for traditional bugs,
Yep.
which tend to be functional related, some folks argue that security bugs are a very, very different beast. They don't show up as a result of functional testing. Does this same metric that which spans still generalize to security bugs?
Quite honestly, the reality is in QA, a functional bug that gets to post-release will require a patch, but it may require a patch in the next cycle. Typically, you won't have a major breakdown, whereas in the case of a security bug at a high severity, it requires a drop everything and fix it right now attitude. These costs are very generic right now. They're built over years as rules of thumb and don't reflect immediate data. As far as I know, nobody is actually publishing literal costs of security vulnerabilities, although I have been on panels with people from Microsoft, and I've heard numbers as high as $1 million to $2 million per patch that has to be released. The reality is when you have to test on, say, 1,500 different QA scenarios before a patch goes live, that's going to be a costly endeavor. And to force yourself to do it in a drop-dead, this must be fixed scenario only amplifies the cost.
So in fact, a 35x might be up by an order of magnitude.
Right. It could be exceptionally low on that. building a security organization within your development organization is probably a good idea. The costs typically, when done right, vastly outweigh the costs of doing it wrong. So the reality is that because security is a very event-driven model early on, where companies don't even think about it until they're confronted with it, if you're never confronted with it, you never have to worry about it. And so people get into a mindset where we never had to pay for security or worry about it before. Why should we have to do it now? We'll fix this bug and we'll be safe, right? The reality is, obviously, that's not how it happens. To build an organization, I recommend that I've seen one or two people within a large organization become the seed to grow that security organization. Oftentimes, it involves understanding just a small amount of risk and being able to express that up so that you can get some funding to start things. I recommend taking one or two security practices that we're going to talk about and beginning to build on that, but make sure that you're scoped correctly. Don't overwork yourself to the point where initiatives start slipping. Obviously, small wins. Day after day after day, every time you're moving forward, after a year, after 2 years, after 5 years, you end up in a much more secure place. So, ROI, not always the most fun thing to talk about from a security technologist standpoint, but from a business standpoint, it's absolutely mandatory. Businesses invest to get returns. Any business that pumps money in and doesn't get returns isn't going to be there for very long. So, effectively, what we have to look at is the measuring of where we're at and how we're going to get to where we need to be. Right now, this is a key part of our strategy at McAfee is finding the highest ROI and investing up front on that. The other part is that you have to have long-term and short-term goals. So initially, it pays to get very quick ROI so that you start getting those daily wins and be able to justify more expenses and more resources to go for the longer-term strategies. So, how we do that? Well, it's metrics. Realistically speaking, metrics are often overlooked. To do a good metric, you need it needs to be automated or very easily collected. It needs to be repeatable, so you can collect the same information time and again, and it needs to be able to effectively track that information over time. This is how we build report cards. This is how we know that we're getting better over time. Effectively, there are a bunch of metrics that we use, and this is just a small set of them. We use number and severity of externally found security bugs per quarter, per year. We use a number and severity of internally found security bugs. So my team, the security architecture group at McAfee, does a lot of these security practices. We measure how effective we are at this, and we look to improve quarter after quarter. Bugs per 1,000 lines of code. This is a surprising metric because you can begin to get predictive with it. Fuzzing coverage percent. Once you define a plan for fuzzing, you can measure the percent of code that you're actually covering within your fuzzing. The same with automated tools, effectively static analysis tools or any other set like that. Input validation. If you count the number of inputs and measure the percent of them who have proper validation, you can actually begin to find weaknesses. Obviously, over time, you want that number to grow and grow and grow up to obviously 100%. So those are the percentages and the breakdowns. The ones that the business guys really worry about are cost pers. So cost per severity 1 bug, either internal or external. Cost per developers. Training a developer is not a cheap endeavor. Cost per penetration test. Obviously, it depends on the type of scope, and then you can just by calculating the amount of dollars you spend in salary and other costs, you can begin to build effectively a measure of costs here. So let's talk a little bit about researchers. The way we have this structured here is I have kind of measured these from what we've seen in practice to work very well, researcher techniques, down to what works a little bit less well in terms of ROI. Effectively, threat models are a concept that Microsoft really brought to the forefront with their security security push back in like 2002. Effectively, a threat model is an architectural analysis paired with a threat enumeration. They go through and they create an architecture and data flow diagram to see how information flows through an application, and they measure what's known as the attack surface, the input and outputs of that application. Now, this can be a very formal procedure, and Microsoft actually has a book called Threat Modeling that goes into the very formal way that they do and how they rank vulnerabilities and how they rank threats, rather, effectively how to do data flow diagrams. I encourage you guys to take a look at it. The reality is that most of the time, it doesn't have to be this formal. It can be only as useful as you need it to be. Oftentimes, I've gotten by with a back of the envelope, as a researcher that is, with a back of an envelope, a quick diagram of big block components of how an architecture worked and points that were likely to be vulnerable in it. Some of this requires a bit of skill, but quite honestly, you can find catalogs of threats out there. So once you identify an input vector or an output vector, you can basically cookbook yourself a threat model. The reality is that this is a great practice with very high ROI and very low investment. Effectively, right after an ROI, right after a threat model, the people involved, the architects, the developers, the QA engineers, they start thinking about security. So the ROI on this is both you end up with an immediate sense of threats, and then secondarily, you end up with a group that is now ready to start thinking about security. I recommend doing threat models before any of the other security activities from a software vendor standpoint, because you prime the pump, and secondarily, this information is actually very useful if you're going on to do a penetration test, if you're going on to do a code audit or any other type of security analysis beyond this. This is all great information to have at your fingertips. Oh, one last thing. They do tend to focus on design issues rather than implementation issues, but once you've done a few of these, you can begin to see implementation issues through the design issues. You can find weak points in the architecture, say, oh, hey, Jim just wrote that HTTP server. And you can be like, okay, I'm fuzzing that one. That one's done for. You can begin to see realistically implementation issues or likely places for them from the design and architecture side. It also works very well to collect information about what's not there. So realistically speaking, if you have a communication link that's holding sensitive information, you can very quickly see that you should have crypto there, or that, oh my gosh, you're keeping your key in an insecure place. So it covers good information from a design standpoint as well. So fuzzing, this is probably number 2, and this is actually a technique that researchers use to find huge numbers of bugs. Early on, I was very skeptical of fuzzing. It seemed like doing a lot of work to get very little results. I have since changed my mind. The reality is it's large-scale fault injection. So it's the proverbial throwing spaghetti against a wall and seeing what sticks. You know, realistically speaking, it works great for covering formatted data files, so Word documents, Excel documents, zip files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Works great for network endpoints. Protocols are effectively structured data as well. Any place where you have structured data, you can fuzz, and you will probably break it. It's exceptionally good at breaking parsers. Realistically speaking, that could be web input, it could be literally anything. Effectively, the upside here is that fuzzing, once you invest a small amount to get your fuzzer set up and doing the right thing, effectively what you're doing is you can put this running at a very small cost for computing resources and a very high return. You can go to sleep, you can go take a nap, you can redirect your resources elsewhere and you still find bugs. Come back 2 days, 5 days later, and you get a nice list of bugs that otherwise you would have had to be involved with. The reality is that this is a fire and forget bug finding solution. Investing in understanding how to write fuzzers using common frameworks or building your own fuzzer is one of the highest value things that any organization can do. The reality is that if you're fuzzing before the researchers, you're going to find the bugs before the researchers. So do this prior to release, obviously, as a part of your QA test plan, and you will knock out all the low-hanging fruit. Obviously, it requires, again, some skill in writing fuzzers, but that skill is very easily won and pays for itself time and time again after you start finding these bugs. So, pen testing. A lot of groups will do application pen testing, especially with web-based applications. Effectively, what they do is they try to break the app. This is actually one that can be good for outsourcing. If you plan to have like an initial baseline, have an external set of eyes looking at your audit is not a bad way to do it. The ROI on this does depend on, one, the amount of skills that you have in-house, two, the amount of dollars that you want to spend on tools to get this done, whether it be a vulnerability analysis tool like a Nessus or a FoundScan, or something like a proxy technology. Realistically speaking, right now you can get by and doing a pen test relatively cheaply. The downside is that it does require a fair amount of knowledge. So it could be sending your group to a SANS course, sending your group to an ethical hacking course by one of the many different groups that do training. I know Foundstone does it, SANS does it. There's like a certified ethical hacker group that will do a training. Take your pick. Effectively, they're teaching you how to use tools to perform a pen test. Now, realistically, the better testers you get, the better bugs you're going to find. So this is a very dependent. The output is very variable based on the skills that you can put in. It does have good ROI. If you have a group that's reasonably well trained and has a reasonable set of tools, at that point, you can continue to use this group cycle after cycle, attacking the same application. You'll begin to shake out a fair number of bugs. So it can have a very good ROI. Again, it works very, very nicely with a threat model, much like much of the stuff that we're talking about here. So, code audits. This is one of the hardest ones to get around here. We actually do, my group does a fair amount of code auditing. We both hand audit and we've invested in static analysis tools. The reason I split these apart is that they both have very different models. They're effectively doing the same thing, but at very different costs and returns. The reality is hand code auditing with good auditors is going to do it's going to find significantly deeper and more intricate bugs than a static analysis tool can. The reality also is that even the best auditors are covering something in the realm of 100,000 lines of code a week. At that rate, it's near impossible to cover effectively an exceptionally large code base at any reasonable rate. Good auditors are very expensive. They cost an arm and a leg to keep on staff, and that kind of brings down to a not such a great ROI. The reality is that static code analysis, there are both free tools and paid tools. The free tools are pretty atrocious. The paid tools are better, but they're not 100% now. What you buy with a paid tool is a base level of code security. You can, with that investment, you're getting consistent coverage. You're getting as much, if not all, of your code base covered, and you're knocking out the low-hanging fruit. Quite honestly, I can't tell you the number of times that we go through and code audit, and we end up writing page after page after page of reports of exceptionally low-hanging fruit issues. Simple string copies, stuff like that. Realistically speaking, you don't want a very expensive code auditor to be finding simple buffer overflows. It's ridiculous. They need to be looking for the deeper issues where they're finding 10 issues per product that nobody else would have found, except for perhaps some crazy Russian or Romanian hacker. So, again, in both cases, it's very dependent on the quality of either the tester or the auditor that you have, or the tool that you purchased or downloaded. So, do a little bit of due diligence. Test your people before you hire them, or vet your tools before you decide on a purchase. So, talk a little bit about reverse engineering. This one is a great one for research, not such a great one for vendors. I came from a reverse engineering background. Much like code auditing, it can find some of the deepest, scariest bugs. Even beyond code auditing, we can find bugs that your compiler introduced that weren't inherent in your code. When you're doing a reverse engineering on binary object code, you're dealing with as close to the truth as possible. You're dealing with the exact code that the computer is going to actually run. You're not confused by maybe clunky language syntax. You're dealing with effectively exactly what the computer is going to see and run. So whether it's a string copy or a mem copy or whatever, it doesn't matter, because I can see you copying something into a static buffer. I don't care what code construct actually built that, but I can see that that's a vulnerability. The reality is that this is a slow process. I know several reverse engineers who are very good at their job, and they can read binary dumps nearly as fast as most people can read source code. Perhaps not 100,000 lines a week of source code fast, but amazingly fast. The reality is that these people are very rare. It's a very isolated skill, and it's very expensive to keep on staff. From a software vendor perspective, the only place that this actually has any applicability, outside of maybe looking at your competitor stuff, is that effectively you're looking at third-party libraries. Now, I come from McAfee. We're an antivirus researcher. We have these people for dealing with malware. Realistically speaking, I wouldn't have these people dealing with product security. They're very good for malware and understanding those threats. We have source code. Finding people who can audit source code is about 100 times easier than finding people who can do quality reverse engineering. That goes to a very low ROI overall from a software vendor standpoint. So, we'll talk a little bit about, from an application security initiative, one of the best things that you can do overall is make sure that your developers and your QA are trained. So this comes down to secure coding training for your developers, security test plan and penetration testing, fuzzing training for your QA engineers. Effectively, this is a great investment, but it's got a very long-term response on your ROI. Training is very dependent on the quality of your trainer. Secondarily, it's very dependent on the quality of your course. Oftentimes, training needs to be reiterated and redone on a yearly, if not less basis, to begin to lock in the skills. Training suffers from high turnover. So if your employees are coming and going often, training them means that you just trained Google's employees, or you just trained Yahoo's employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Realistically, you can do things to help. Look for security knowledge in new hires. It's one of the least seen HR questions of, have you ever thought about code security? People don't actually ask that in interviews. They probably should. You can begin to build a security organization by vetting for security knowledge. So, effectively, again, the ROI it's okay, and this is probably one of the best security initiatives that you can undertake, but realistically speaking, it's going to take a long time to get there. So this is probably one of those where you build over time in your organization. You can speed it up through an intensive training program. Microsoft stopped and trained all their developers. Realistically speaking, most dev organizations don't have that kind of backing for an application security initiative, and they don't have that kind of time or resources to have that many trainers to actually train everybody when we decide to stop. So, integration of the SDLC. This is kind of the holy grail of AppSec, getting security thought at every level of the life cycle for building software. Now, again, this is the classic waterfall life cycle. This works equally well for agile methodologies. Now, putting security into ideas at the requirements phase, using good security design principles, using good threat modeling, doing code reviews and security code auditing, using automated tools, fuzzing, security test plans, penetration testing, all the way through the cycle, having a good coherent disclosure and response policy for post-release vulnerability work. All this makes security a part of the software development lifecycle. So the ROI depends on how you're implementing this. The reality is that this is where every AppSec initiative should be down the line. It's a long-term goal. It takes a bit to get there, but it's highly effective. So the reality is I don't think a lot of researchers understand about vendors. As vendors, it's our responsibility to enlighten them. The more advanced vendors the more advanced researchers, people who have been around the game a long time and dealt with a lot of security or software companies, understand how software is built. They can stay for the long run. The problem arises with one-offs. So what we're going to talk a little bit about is about disclosure. And I'm not going to beat a dead horse. We're going to talk about full disclosure, non-disclosure, and responsible disclosure. This is a topic that's been discussed many, many times in the past. Realistically speaking, there are a lot of holy wars fought about how disclosure should work. Full disclosure can range from giving immediate zero-day information, including a proof of concept like what happened to McAfee yesterday, up to working with a vendor and releasing full information prior to the patch. The reality is that it's up to the researcher at this point on the level of information that they want to go. I actually support the second version of that. Full information prior to a patch is very helpful. There are a lot of people out there that build IDS systems, vulnerability assessment systems. This information was very, very helpful for me when I worked on a vulnerability assessment engine. If I could get information about a vulnerability, it was very helpful. The reality is that it doesn't matter all that much. If I can get a patch, I can find that vulnerability. As reverse engineering tools have gotten better, we don't need full disclosure as much, but neither did the bad guys. Binary diffing and patch reversing pretty much opened the door. Once the code's out there, the details may as well be, because it'll only take a short period of time before anybody gets there. So, non-disclosure. This comes down to whether a researcher decides to sit on it or a vendor decides to sit on it through their AppSec initiative, finding a bug, or oftentimes this ends up with a silent patch. Again, patch diffing will find this stuff if anybody cares to look. If you're a big vendor, people will reverse your patches. For instance, Microsoft, I would say that every patch that security patch they've ever published has been reversed by, one, every vulnerability assessment company, probably two, every IDS company, and three, probably every high-end bad guy hacker has decided to go take a peek at it. So realistically speaking, not talking about security isn't really helping anybody. There are some groups out there that tout anti-sec, where they try to force researchers to feel bad about working with vendors. Realistically speaking, that's not good for vendors, not really good for the security industry itself, but it is good for hackers. So there are legal battles. So for instance, sometimes companies will actually legally try and fight a researcher to prevent them from releasing information. Typically, I think that's a bit heavy-handed and quite honestly, often unnecessary. You're not really protecting your customers by doing this versus making a coherent fix. Finally, as more and more stuff gets going, regulation might force us to be a little bit more open about this. So that brings us to where most people are today. In the realm of responsible disclosure. Now, realistically, this covers the gambit from somebody using this moniker to do whatever they want to a very structured set of policies published and agreed upon by many different people. So it's not necessarily incompatible with a full disclosure or a non-disclosure. It just comes down to a realization of where we are and where we've grown as a security industry. Quite honestly, the main point on this is that researchers notify vendors and then are willing to wait for a patch. Back in the old days, full disclosure was a tactic to force vendors to respond. Now more and more vendors have teams internally, or at least a guy internally, who can begin to drive a patch. It may not be immediately, but the reality is that sometimes software takes a while to fix. When you have to test on 1,500 different QA environments, it's going to take a fair amount of time to actually execute those test cases. So right now, responsible disclosure comes to kind of a middle ground that most people can live with, and it's sort of the de facto standard right now. Obviously, you have people on both sides that are still very adamant that full disclosure and non-disclosure are the way to go. Quite honestly, it's not that easy to do things black and white right now. So, disclosure policies are an important concept for a software vendor. Having your actions written down so that a researcher knows what to expect from you is very important. I have a couple of examples here. One is the Organization for Internet Safety. It's the one that we use at McAfee. It's a well-documented, well-structured set of disclosure policies. Many companies use it. I believe this is the one that Microsoft uses, Symantec. It's a coalition of big software companies. Now, obviously, and I came from the researcher community, we had concerns that it had a vendor bias. And in some ways it does. Realistically speaking, it does require a researcher to wait under most circumstances for a patch to arrive. Now, I will be the very first to say that in my younger days, I used to think that was ridiculous. Over the years working at EI, I realized that putting customers at danger, putting individuals and their life savings and all this stuff at danger is a harder ethical battle to fight than it was when I was a young guy raging against the machine. The reality is that working with vendors is probably the most ethical thing that you can do in this situation. And the OIS has a good set of guidelines. Now, RF policy, probably one of the very first public disclosure agreements, had a very full disclosure bias. It was an early stage one. It was notable because somebody actually wrote down a disclosure policy. It began to infiltrate into both researchers and development organizations as a way to do business. Realistically, it's got very loose rules, and a lot of processes are not well defined. That brought up two others. One publishes an IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force draft, back in 2002. It is just a draft, but it's a public document that you can take a look at. That was written by Steve Christie and Chris Weiss-Opel back when Chris was at Stake and Steve was at MITRE. It's a comprehensive document, and it covers a lot of information. It actually shares a lot in common with the OIS guidelines. Then finally, in about 2003, in a recommendation to the president, NIAC and the Department of Homeland Security published a set of papers that described a vulnerability response process that, again, shared a lot with the OIS and fell into the responsible disclosure policy. So realistically speaking, you can find as many disclosure policies as there are companies and research organizations that bother to write them down. As a vendor, I encourage you to find one that fits with your ethics and stick with it. Realistically, by following a published vulnerability process, you can actually make life easier for yourself and for researchers that are dealing with you. So, let's talk a little bit about the reality of vulnerability disclosure. When a researcher comes to you and says, hey, I found a vulnerability in your software, what happens within your organization? Well, first of all, it does help to already have that security issue in place. So had we not had an internal policy on how to deal with a zero-day vulnerability, it would have been chickens with their heads cut off running around yesterday. The reality is that having this stuff in place helps us to be able to respond, both in unknowns and known situations. So when a researcher comes and wants to work with us, we have a plan. When a researcher chooses to not work with us, we also have a plan. So it makes it you have to make it easy for researchers to work with you. Right now, from a security vendor standpoint, we have to build that bridge. We have to do the right thing. I can't name the number of vendors, and at McAfee we have a fair number of researchers that are researching malware. Periodically we find vulnerabilities in products. I can't tell you the number of people that I've had trouble finding security contacts at. I always thought security at a domain name was a standard, and I've learned, unfortunately, that there is no standard in that. So I do recommend that you do security at your company for any kind of security issues. Do use PGP or GPG. This is probably the most sensitive information that can travel around your company. It has an unspecified amount of damage potential. Basically, have a /security.html that has your contact information, has your PGP or GPG key, and post a link or the full text of your disclosure policy. Put this in the About Us link on your website. Make it public so that people can actually find it. It helps for researchers not having to go chase around to find you. So one company, PayPal, actually did just that. They published all their stuff, including their own custom disclosure policy saying, if you're working with us, we won't sue you. It was a very intriguing concept where they encouraged vulnerability research without pushing them to the sides and making them feel threatened or scared. So a threatened or scared researcher is one that's going to sell your stuff on the zero-day market. So it always helps to get that information directly to you as a security practitioner. So respond soon. You can't sit on this stuff for that long. Researchers are very impatient, and they won't sit and wait for you. The reality is that you should acknowledge it immediately and attempt to determine the risk and validate the vulnerability in very short order. Quite honestly, it shouldn't take more than a day or two unless it's a very serious security vulnerability. So, communication. It's one of the most overlooked pieces. Communicating with researchers is of the utmost importance. I recommend weekly status updates, even if you don't have anything new to tell them. Make sure that they understand that you're in this with them, that they're getting continuous information about how this bug is progressing. One of the most common things that I saw as a researcher is that you'd submit a bug, they would acknowledge it, and then they would ignore you for days and days and days. You would have to go and ask the security vendor or the software vendor, how is this coming along? They may have patched and not even told you. You have to keep continual information from the vendor side feeding into the researcher side. Now, the contrary is also true. The researcher should be willing to give information to the vendor upon request. So if there's a proof of concept, they should be willing to share that. Realistically speaking, the researcher that is working with the vendor is there to help the vendor. They're putting their own time, typically for free, into this, and they're getting very little out of it other than perhaps some credit. Quite honestly, we have to build that relationship. These are people who are spending their own time and considerable amounts of skill finding bugs in your software for free. We have to honor that by at least making sure that they know what's going on. So, release day. So we're ready to release our patch. The researchers ready to release their information. Effectively, how do we coordinate? Well, try hard not to slip, and be prepared for questions from media, from customers. So have a plan internally. I'm speeding this up. We're about ready to get booted. So one more slide, and then we're out of here. So one thing that we can do is build some bridges. Companies like Microsoft with their Blue Hat conference, security conferences like this, Black Hat, CanSec, teach your people to understand researchers. Be nice to researchers. Read papers written by them. Quite honestly, there's a lot of upsides that can build that bridge. And then one last, any questions? Cool. All right. I guess that ran a little bit long. Thanks, guys.
Ryan, are you gonna be here for a little bit longer?
I actually have to go and do